It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Arthur Thorne laughed as he handed his empty champagne flute to Elena Thorne in front of the city's most influential investors. The crystal clinked against her palm, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed in the sudden silence of the gala's VIP lounge. "Don't just stand there, Elena," he said, his voice booming with the practiced confidence of a man who had spent decades demanding excellence while delivering none. "Be a dear and find a waiter. Or better yet, take it to the kitchen yourself. You've always been more comfortable with the help than with board members." A ripple of stifled titters rose from the circle of socialites surrounding them. The air in the grand atrium was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and even more expensive perfume, a cloying sweetness that made Elena's throat tighten. She looked down at the glass in her hand. It was a vintage baccarat, heavy and cold. "I'm actually in the middle of a conversation, Father," she said, her voice a low, steady contrast to his theatrical roar. "A conversation." Cassidy Thorne stepped forward, her sequins catching the light like the scales of a predatory fish. She adjusted her camera, her phone already mounted on a gimbal. "With who? The caterer? I'm trying to film a day in the life of an heiress vlog, and you're ruining the aesthetic with that bargain bin blazer. Honestly, Elena, it's embarrassing. You work in an office. You don't have to look like you live in one." Margaret Thorne sighed, smoothing the silk of her gown without looking at either of her daughters. "Do as your father says, Elena. There's no need to make a scene in front of the Sterlings. We have a reputation to maintain, even if you've chosen a life of administrative obscurity." Elena felt the familiar heat of a rage spike behind her ribs, but she didn't let it reach her face. She had spent years perfecting this mask. To them, she was the disappointment, the middle child who had traded the family's social standing for a boring career at Vanguard Holdings. They saw the minimalist cut of her charcoal suit and assumed it was cheap because it lacked a visible logo. They saw her silence and assumed it was submission. Beside her, Julian Vane shifted, his hand momentarily brushing her elbow in a silent gesture of support. As the family's longtime attorney and Elena's closest confidant, he was the only one in the room who knew the weight of the phone currently vibrating in her pocket. "Perhaps Elena is just tired," Julian said, his voice smooth and neutral. "The corporate world can be quite demanding." Arthur snorted, reaching for a fresh glass from a passing tray. "Demanding? She's an operations lackey. I, on the other hand, have a meeting tomorrow morning with the new executive board at Vanguard. They're looking for a consultant to oversee the regional merger, and they'd be fools not to come to the man who built Thorne Industries from the ground up." Elena's thumb traced the rim of the empty glass. "Vanguard is very selective about their consultants, Arthur." He didn't even look at her as he spoke. "They're selective about talent, which is why you'll never understand it. Now go. The glass isn't going to wash itself." Elena turned away, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble. She didn't head for the kitchen. Instead, she stepped into the shadows of a stone pillar and pulled her phone from her clutch. The screen was lit with a notification from Marcus Sterling. "The liquidation of Thorne Industries' remaining assets is finalized. We need your signature on the final acquisition order before the board meeting at 0800 tomorrow. The lion is ready to wake." She typed a 3-word response. "Proceed. No exceptions." A second later, her phone buzzed again. It was a notification from the family group chat. Cassidy had posted a photo of Elena holding the empty glass, captioned with a string of laughing emojis and the text, "When you're born a thorn but destined to be a maid, awkward corporate life." Elena stared at the laughing emojis until they blurred. For 5 years, she had watched her father bleed the family legacy dry while blaming her for not contributing to his vanity projects. She had watched Cassidy spend thousands on followers while the Thorne employees' pension funds withered. She had stayed silent while they mocked her assistant job, never once mentioning that Vanguard Holdings hadn't just hired her. They had built an entire division around her. She looked back at the lounge. Arthur was gesturing wildly, regaling a group of investors with a story about a power move he'd made in the 90s. He looked bloated with his own self-importance, a king of a crumbling castle. Julian appeared at her side, his expression unreadable to anyone but her. "The board is expecting the operations director to chair the meeting tomorrow, Elena. Marcus is already there." "I know," she whispered. The rage in her chest had cooled into something sharper, something surgical. "Arthur thinks he's going there to save his legacy," Julian said quietly. "He thinks he's the one holding the cards." Elena watched her sister strike a pouty pose for her followers, the flash of the camera reflecting in the cold glass of the atrium. She thought about the face slap that was coming, the moment Arthur would walk into that boardroom and realize that the daughter he'd treated like a servant was the one who held his entire future in her hands. "He's right about one thing," Elena said, her voice as cold as the champagne she'd been ordered to fetch. "The new board is very selective about talent." She dropped the empty baccarat glass into a nearby linen bin. It didn't break, but the heavy thud felt like a gavel striking a desk. "And tomorrow," she added, "he's finally going to find out exactly where I belong." As she walked toward the exit, her phone buzzed one last time. It was a calendar reminder for the morning. 0800 a.m., termination review, Arthur Thorne. Elena didn't look back. The laughing emojis were still scrolling through the group chat, but for the first time in years, Elena Thorne was the only one who knew who would have the last laugh. The steakhouse smelled of charred wagyu and aged oak, a scent that usually signaled success. But as Elena Thorne sat at the edge of the velvet booth, she felt only the cold dampness of the water glass in her hand. Across from her, Arthur Thorne adjusted his silk tie, his chest puffed out like a peacock. He had ordered the vintage Bordeaux without looking at the price, laughing loudly with a group of business associates at the next table about his guaranteed ascent to the chairmanship. "Elena, don't just sit there like a statue," he snapped, not even looking at her. "My steak is overdone, tell the waiter, and while you're up, find my reading glasses, I left them in the car." She didn't blink. "The steak looks medium rare, just as you asked, Father." "Did I ask for your opinion on culinary arts?" He sneered, the sound cutting through the ambient jazz of the room. "I asked for an assistant who knows how to follow instructions. If you can't handle a simple dinner, how do you expect to survive in the real world?" Beside him, Cassidy Thorne didn't look up from her phone, though the ring light she'd clipped to her device bathed the table in an artificial, blinding white. Elena, move your arm. You're ruining the aesthetic of my family excellence story." "People want to see the wine, not your bargain bin sleeves." The humiliation was a familiar weight, but tonight it felt different. It felt heavy with the irony of what was tucked inside her handbag. Beneath her lipstick and keys lay the notarized proxy votes from the Vanguard Holdings minority block. "I'll get your glasses," she said quietly, sliding out of the booth. As she walked toward the foyer, her heels clicking against the polished marble, she spotted a familiar figure near the coat check. Julian Vane stood there, looking every bit the high-priced litigator he was. When he saw her, his expression softened into something resembling pity, then sharpened into professional steel. "The final signatures are in," he whispered, handing her a slim leather folder. "Marcus Sterling just called. The board is unanimous. They're tired of his embezzlement and his ego. Tomorrow morning at 8, the locks change." Elena took the folder, the grain of the leather smooth against her palm. "And the severance package?" "Non-existent," he replied. "We're triggering the morality clause based on the evidence you gathered of his expense account fraud. He's going to owe the company millions." She thanked him and turned back toward the dining room. When she returned to the table, the atmosphere had shifted from arrogant to predatory. "Change of plans," her father said, leaning back and picking his teeth with a silver-plated pick. "I forgot my personal card at home. You'll have to put this on your account. Consider it a thank you for all the years I've supported you." Cassidy let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Oh my God, Dad, look at her face." She's probably calculating how many months of rent this dinner costs. She turned her phone camera toward her sister, the lens glowing like a judgmental eye. "Say cheese for the followers, Elle. Tell them how it feels to finally contribute to the Thorne legacy." Margaret Thorne finally spoke, though her voice was a mere shadow. Arthur, perhaps that's enough. She works hard. She works at a desk, Margaret. I build empires. He dismissed her without a second thought. He shoved the bill, a staggering 4-figure total, toward his daughter. Pay it, now. I have a big day tomorrow, and I don't want to be late for my coronation. Elena looked at the bill, then at the man who shared her DNA but none of her heart. She reached into her purse, but she didn't pull out a personal debit card. She pulled out a black corporate card, one with the Vanguard Holdings logo embossed in gold, a card reserved only for the executive board. I'll take care of it, she said, her voice eerily calm. Arthur's eyes narrowed, spotting the gold foil. Where did you get that? Did you steal a company card from the office? It's an authorized account, she said, handing it to the hovering waiter. And you're right, you shouldn't be late tomorrow, 8 o'clock sharp in the boardroom. She stood up, leaving them with the dregs of their expensive wine and their hollow pride. Enjoy the steak. It's the last thing this company will ever buy for you. As she walked out into the cool night air, she checked her watch. 10 hours. In 10 hours, the man who treated her like a servant would realize he was the only one in the room who didn't belong. The countdown had reached its final stage, and for the first time in her life, Elena wasn't afraid of the explosion. Julian Vane pushed the heavy vellum folder across the mahogany desk, his expression unreadable behind silver-rimmed spectacles. The office was quiet, save for the distant hum of the city waking up 30 floors below. The scent of expensive cedarwood and old paper hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, panicked energy Elena felt radiating from her own skin. It's all there, Julian said, his voice a low baritone that commanded attention. The signatures are verified. The board has already ratified the transfer. As of midnight, you hold the controlling interest. Your father has no idea that his retirement clause was actually a forfeiture trigger. Elena Thorne ran her fingers over the embossed Vanguard Holdings seal on the folder. The paper felt cool and slightly textured, a physical weight that represented years of swallowed insults and quiet endurance. She didn't smile. There was no joy in this, only a grim, surgical necessity. He thinks I stole the gold card, she murmured, her eyes fixed on the documents. He spent the last 12 hours convinced he's going to watch the police lead me out of the boardroom in handcuffs. Julian leaned back, a faint, predatory glint in his eyes. Let him think it. Arrogance is a blindfold, Elena, and Arthur has been wearing it for decades. 2 hours later, the glass doors of Vanguard Holdings slid open with a whisper of compressed air. The lobby was a cathedral of white marble and brushed steel, smelling faintly of expensive filtered air and industrial floor wax. Elena stepped onto the polished floor, the rhythmic asterisk click-clack of her heels echoing against the high ceiling. She wasn't wearing the modest, blending in at the back dresses her family preferred. Today, she wore a charcoal power suit tailored with razor-sharp precision. There she is. The thief of the hour, the voice boomed across the lobby, turning heads. Arthur Thorne stood near the elevators, flanked by Cassidy and Margaret. He looked every bit the retired titan in a navy pinstripe suit that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. He held his chin high, his face flushed with a mixture of indignation and triumph. Cassidy stood beside him, her phone already out, the camera lens pointed directly at Elena. She was dressed in a vibrant lime green silk ensemble, looking more like she was headed to a brunch than a corporate headquarters. Smile for the followers, Elena, Cassidy mocked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I'm sure the prison chic look will be a huge hit for my morning reel. Margaret Thorne stood a step behind them, her hands clutched tightly around her designer handbag. She looked at her eldest daughter not with concern, but with a weary, disappointed sigh. Elena, really, to steal from the company? After everything your father did to build this legacy, it's just so common. Arthur stepped forward, invading Elena's personal space. He smelled of heavy cologne and expensive tobacco. I've already spoken to security, you ungrateful girl, he hissed, his voice low but vibrating with rage. I told them to let you up to the boardroom. I want the entire executive team to see the look on your face when the fraud investigators show up. You thought that card gave you power. It gave you a one-way ticket to a cage. Elena didn't flinch. She met his gaze with a cold, glassy stare that seemed to confuse him for a fleeting second. "I told you to be here at 8 sharp, Arthur," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "I see you've managed to be punctual for once. It's a shame you wasted the effort on an audience that won't be cheering for you." "Still playing the part?" Arthur laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. He turned to the small crowd of employees who had paused to watch the spectacle. "Look at her, my daughter, the office clerk, trying to pretend she belongs in the room where real decisions are made. She's a delusional little girl playing with Daddy's toys." He reached out, trying to grab the folder Elena held tucked under her arm, but she stepped back with a fluid, practiced grace. "Don't," she said. The word was a quiet blade. "Oh, I won't have to," Arthur sneered, gesturing toward the elevator bank. "Marcus Sterling is already upstairs. He's been waiting for me to give him the green light to scrub your name from this building permanently. Move. You're blocking the path of people who actually have business here." They moved as a pack into the elevator, the silence inside the gold-mirrored car thick and suffocating. Cassidy continued to film, her smirk reflected a dozen times in the polished metal. Margaret stared at the floor indicator, as if trying to distance herself from the inevitable explosion. Arthur adjusted his cuffs, preening in the mirror, the image of a man about to reclaim his throne. When the doors opened on the executive floor, the atmosphere changed. The air was colder here, the carpet thicker, muffling their footsteps as they approached the double oak doors of the main boardroom. Arthur didn't knock. He threw the doors open with a flourish, expecting to see Marcus Sterling and the board members ready to condemn his daughter. Instead, the room was silent. A dozen men and women in dark suits sat around the massive mahogany table, their faces grim. At the head of the table sat Marcus Sterling, the CEO of Vanguard Holdings. He wasn't looking at Arthur. He was looking at his watch. "You're late, Arthur," Marcus said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "Just a minor delay dealing with the trash," Arthur said, marching toward the empty chair at Marcus's right hand, the seat of the vice chairman. He pointed a finger back at Elena, who remained standing by the door. "Marcus, I assume the police are on their way. I have the evidence of the card theft right here." Marcus didn't look at the finger. He looked at Elena, then back at the folder in her hand. A strange, knowing tension filled the room. "Arthur," Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave. "Sit down. We have exactly 10 minutes before the global announcement goes live, and there are things you clearly don't understand." Elena moved then, walking slowly toward the table. She didn't take a side seat. She walked toward the podium at the front of the room, the one reserved for the person delivering the state of the company address. She felt the weight of the documents in her hand, the culmination of 1,000 silent nights. She checked the digital clock on the wall. 2 minutes, Elena whispered to herself, the sound lost in the rustle of Arthur's suit as he sat down, still wearing his mask of arrogant triumph. He had no idea that the chair he was sitting in was already being pulled out from under him. The digital numbers on the wall bled a harsh, crimson light across the mahogany table. 1 minute and 40 seconds. Elena felt the cool, brushed aluminum of the podium beneath her palms. It was a solid, grounding weight against the frantic thrumming in her chest. She didn't look at the men seated before her. She kept her eyes fixed on the flickering red colon of the clock, pulsing like a failing heart. Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, the expensive hide creaking under his weight. He checked his gold watch, the movement deliberate and performative. "This is pathetic, even for you," he said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence of the room. "Standing up there like you've earned the right to speak. Marcus, I don't know what game you're playing, but my daughter belongs in the archives, not the spotlight. This family charity has its limits." Marcus Sterling didn't look up from his tablet. He simply adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Julian Vane leaned against the far wall, his arms crossed. The lawyer's gaze was fixed on Arthur, a predatory stillness in his posture that should have served as a warning to anyone with less ego. "I gave you every chance to look at the internal audit, Arthur," Elena said. Her voice was quiet, devoid of the tremor he expected. I sent the files to your personal server 3 times this week. I even left a hard copy on your desk." He laughed, a sharp, barking sound that grated like sandpaper against the tension in the room. "I don't waste my time on your efficiency reports, Elena. I have real business to conduct. While you were busy playing with spreadsheets and organizing the coffee runs, I was securing the future of this company. You're a glorified paper pusher. Sit down before you make a scene that even I can't clean up." In the back of the room, Cassidy Thorne was holding her phone up, her ring light casting a ghoulish, artificial glow over her features. She was whispering to her followers, her words a venomous stream of commentary about her sister's delusions of grandeur. The scent of her heavy, floral perfume drifted forward, cloying and suffocating in the dry air of the boardroom. 50 seconds, Julian announced. The rhythm of his voice was like a gavel striking a bench. Elena looked directly at her father. The arrogance in his eyes was a physical weight, a familiar pressure she had lived under for 3 decades. "The article is titled The Thorne Legacy, a Foundation of Glass. It's scheduled for global syndication in less than a minute. I wrote it myself, but the data was provided by the very banks you thought were in your pocket. I've been the one managing those accounts for 3 years, Arthur. Did you really think I wouldn't notice the discrepancies?" Arthur's smirk didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed. He adjusted his silk tie, his knuckles white. "You think a blog post is going to topple me? I am Vanguard. I built this. You're just a ghost in the machine, a shadow I let stay because your mother begged me to. You have no power here." "The ghost has been keeping the books," she replied, her voice gaining a cold, crystalline edge. She reached into the folder Marcus had handed her, her fingers brushing the crisp, heavy bond of the documents. "You always said I was invisible. You were right. I was invisible enough to see everything you tried to hide. I was invisible enough to record every private conversation you had in this office when you thought I was just filing papers." The air in the room seemed to thicken, charged with the ozone of the massive servers humming behind the walls. The vibration of the HVAC system felt like a low-frequency growl beneath their feet. Arthur's phone, resting on the table, vibrated. Then Marcus's phone. Then Cassidy's. A chorus of digital pings erupted, a staccato symphony of incoming alerts that cut through the silence. "What is this?" Arthur snapped, finally reaching for his device. His face was still flushed with the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable, but his fingers fumbled as he swiped the screen. Elena didn't watch him. She watched the clock. 5, 4, 3, 2. "You should have read the email, Dad," she whispered. The large monitor behind her flickered to life, slaving itself to the global press release. The headline wasn't just text, it was a digital execution. Arthur's face didn't just pale. It seemed to hollow out as he read the first 3 lines. The ruddy color of his ego drained away, leaving behind a gray, parchment-like mask of disbelief. He stared at his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen as if he could somehow push the words back into the ether. Cassidy's phone dropped from her hand, hitting the plush carpet with a dull thud. Her live stream was still running, capturing the exact moment the Thorne patriarch realized the throne was made of salt and the tide was coming in. Elena stepped away from the podium. She didn't stay to watch him scramble. She walked toward the door, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat against the floor. "Elena!" Arthur surged to his feet, his chair flipping backward and crashing against the windows. "You can't do this. I'll have you erased." She stopped at the threshold, her hand on the heavy brass handle. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to see the wreckage to know it was complete. "You already tried to erase me, Arthur. You just forgot that ghosts can write." As she stepped out into the hallway, the sound of a second wave of notifications filled the room, the sound of the world finally looking at the man she had seen clearly her entire life. The scent of white lilies in the foyer of the Thorne estate was usually a sign of a celebration, but tonight the fragrance felt funereal. Elena Thorne stepped over the threshold, the click of her heels on the black marble sounding like the cocking of a weapon. An hour had passed since the live stream ended, long enough for the digital wildfire to reach every phone in the room, yet the long mahogany dining table was still set for 20. Arthur Thorne stood at the head of the table, a crystal tumbler of scotch gripped so tightly his knuckles were white. He didn't look like a man whose empire was crumbling. He looked like a king preparing to execute a messenger. Across from him, Margaret Thorne sat in her usual place, her spine a rigid line of denial as she rearranged the silverware with trembling fingers. "You're late for your own victory dinner," Arthur said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He didn't look at her. He stared at the reflection of the chandelier in his drink. "Though I suppose victory is a flexible term for someone who just committed social suicide." Elena didn't take her seat. She stood at the opposite end of the table, the vast expanse of polished wood between them feeling like a battlefield. "The guests seem to have found other engagements, Arthur." "I saw 3 cars leaving the driveway as I pulled in." "Cowards and fair-weather friends," Cassidy Thorne snapped from the side of the room. She was pacing near the windows, her phone a glowing rectangle of anxiety in her hand. She looked at Elena with a raw, unadulterated loathing. "Do you have any idea what you've done? My sponsors are dropping like flies. They're calling me the daughter of a fraud." "You didn't just hit him, Elena. You burned the whole house down with us inside." "Then you should have stepped out of the house when I warned you," Elena replied calmly. She reached out, her finger tracing the cold, condensation-slicked rim of a water glass. The sensory chill was a grounding wire for the adrenaline still humming in her veins. Arthur finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, the arrogance of 30 years of unopposed power curdling into something feral. "You think a few doctored spreadsheets and a dramatic speech change the math? I built Vanguard. I am the board. Tomorrow morning, I'll have a dozen PR firms scrubbing the internet and a team of lawyers filing a libel suit that will bury you so deep you'll forget what sunlight looks like." He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, the heavy scent of scotch and expensive tobacco trailing him. "You're a clever girl, Elena, but you're still just a girl playing with matches. You'll hand over the original drives, you'll sign a retraction stating the live stream was a performance art piece gone wrong, and maybe, just maybe, I won't let you rot in a cell." The audacity of it was almost breathtaking. Even now, with the world watching the evidence of his embezzlement and the systematic erasure of his partners, he expected her to kneel. It was a rage spike that hit Elena with the force of a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. She simply met his gaze, her expression as unreadable as a frozen lake. "I didn't come here to negotiate, Arthur," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "And I didn't come here to eat." She reached into her clutch and pulled out a single, cream-colored envelope. She didn't hand it to him, she slid it across the mahogany. It glided over the polished surface, coming to rest just inches from his drink. "What is this? More evidence?" Arthur sneered, not touching it. "It's an invitation," Elena said. "To the emergency board meeting. It starts in 10 minutes. Virtually, of course. No one wanted to be in the same zip code as you tonight." Arthur laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "I called that meeting, Elena. I'm the chairman. I've already postponed it." "You were the chairman," a new voice interrupted. Julian Vane stepped into the dining room from the shadows of the hallway. He wasn't wearing his usual friendly smirk. He looked like a man who had spent the last hour signing death warrants. He held a tablet in his hand, the screen glowing with a grid of faces, the Vanguard Board of Directors. "The bylaws are quite specific, Arthur," Julian said, his tone professional and cold. "In the event of a criminal investigation involving the chair, a 2/3 majority can bypass the postponement. Marcus Sterling has already moved for a vote of no confidence." Arthur's face went a sickly shade of gray, the color of wet ash. He looked at the tablet, then back at Elena. "Marcus, I made that man, he wouldn't dare." "He didn't have a choice," Elena said. She felt a flicker of secret power as she watched Arthur's hand begin to shake. "Because Marcus knows that I don't just have the spreadsheets. I have the offshore routing numbers, the ones tied to his private accounts, too. He chose his survival over your friendship. It's the lesson you taught us all, isn't it? Loyalty is for people who can't afford the alternative." The room went silent, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It sounded like a countdown. Cassidy had stopped pacing. She was staring at her father as if seeing a stranger, the realization of his fall finally piercing through her self-absorption. "You're bluffing," Arthur whispered, though the conviction was gone. He looked at Margaret, seeking some shred of the blind support he'd feasted on for decades. "Margaret, tell her she's delusional." Margaret Thorne didn't look up from her silver. She carefully placed a dessert spoon next to a knife, her movements robotic. "The lilies are wilting, Arthur," she said softly. "I told the florist they wouldn't last in this heat." The dismissal was more cutting than any shout. Arthur turned back to Elena, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unbridled fury. He lunged forward, his hand swinging toward her face in a desperate, clumsy arc. Elena didn't move. She didn't have to. Julian stepped forward, catching Arthur's wrist with a sharp, metallic snap of force. "Don't make this a police matter before the sun even comes up, Arthur. It's over." Elena looked at her father, really looked at him, and realized she felt nothing. No satisfaction, no pity, just the cold clarity of a job nearly finished. "The vote is happening now," Julian said, looking at the tablet. Elena turned toward the door, her silk dress whispering against the floor. She stopped at the threshold, the same place she had stood as a child, watching him dominate every room he entered. "Check the news in 5 minutes, Arthur," Elena said, her voice echoing in the hollow space of the manor. "The board isn't just removing you, they're liquidating your personal shares to cover the discrepancies. You aren't just losing the company, you're losing this house. I'd start packing the lilies. They don't belong to you anymore." As she walked out into the night air, the sound of Arthur's glass shattering against the mahogany followed her, the sound of a man realizing that the tide hadn't just come in, it had swept him out to sea. She reached her car and saw a single notification on her phone. It was from Marcus Sterling. "The vote is unanimous. What's the next move?" Elena looked back at the darkened windows of the estate. The countdown wasn't over. It was just reaching 0. She tapped out a short reply. "Call the authorities. I want him to watch the sunrise through bars." The grand ballroom of the Vanguard Plaza smelled of forced elegance, overpowering lilies and expensive, heavy perfumes that masked the scent of desperation. Arthur Thorne stood at the center of a semicircle of investors, his hand gripping a Scotch glass like a scepter. Even with the walls closing in, his suit was perfectly pressed, his arrogance shielding him from the reality of the previous night's collapse at the estate. He was still playing the part of the lion, unaware that the cage had already been locked from the outside. "My daughter has always had a vivid imagination," Arthur was saying, his voice booming for the benefit of the surrounding board members. He offered a dismissive wave of his glass, the amber liquid catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. "A bit of a breakdown, really. Stress of the position. We're handling the transition internally to protect the Thorne legacy." Elena Thorne stepped into the light of the chandelier, her heels clicking against the white marble with the precision of a metronome. Beside her, Julian Vane adjusted his silk tie, his expression as unreadable as a legal brief. Elena wore a gown of midnight blue that shimmered like oil on water, a sharp contrast to the pale, nervous faces of the socialites around her. "Is that what we're calling it, Arthur?" Elena's voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying clarity that sliced through the ambient chatter. The room seemed to tilt toward her. Arthur turned, his eyes narrowing as he spotted her. He didn't see a daughter, he saw a nuisance he hadn't yet managed to crush. "Elena, I thought I made it clear that you were no longer welcome at company functions. Security is already on their way to the lobby. Don't make this more pathetic than it already is." Cassidy Thorne, standing nearby with a champagne flute, let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Really, Elena, showing up in a dress that costs more than your integrity. It's embarrassing to watch you cling to a world that's already moved on." "The only thing embarrassing here, Cassidy, is how little you know about where that champagne came from," Elena replied, her gaze never leaving her father. Marcus Sterling stepped onto the small mahogany stage at the front of the room, tapping the microphone. The feedback whined once, a sharp needle of sound that brought the room into an expectant hush. "If I could have everyone's attention, we have a late addition to tonight's agenda, a matter of corporate transparency regarding the future of Vanguard Holdings." Arthur smirked, leaning toward a fellow investor with a conspiratorial wink. "Watch this. I've spent 30 years building this name." One disgruntled employee isn't going to change the weather. The massive digital screen behind Marcus flickered to life. It didn't show the annual growth charts or the Thorne family charitable contributions. Instead, a series of scanned documents filled the frame. Forged signatures, wire transfer receipts to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, a side-by-side comparison of the company's internal ledger versus the fraudulent one Arthur had presented to the board and the IRS. The silence that followed was visceral, a physical weight that pressed the air out of the room. Arthur's face underwent a grotesque transformation. The ruddy, self-assured mask of the Thorne patriarch didn't just slip, it disintegrated. His jaw slackened, his lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, pathetic twitch that betrayed his sudden terror. The vibrant color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a sallow, grayish hue that made him look 20 years older in a matter of seconds. His eyes, once sharp and predatory, became glassy and unfocused, darting frantically toward the exits as if searching for a hole to crawl into. A single bead of sweat tracked a slow, jagged path through the deep lines of his forehead, catching the harsh glare of the stage lights. His hands, usually so steady, began to shake so violently that the ice in his glass rattled like a death knell against the crystal. Margaret Thorne, standing in the shadows of the velvet curtains, let out a soft, choked gasp, her hand flying to her throat as she looked away. The board members, men who had played golf with Arthur for decades, stepped back in unison. It was a synchronized retreat that left him standing alone in a widening circle of judgment. Those are fabrications," Arthur stammered, his voice cracking into a high, thin reed. "Marcus, explain this. This is some kind of sick joke." Marcus Sterling didn't look at him. He looked at Elena with a nod of professional respect. "The evidence has been verified by 3 independent forensic auditors, and the authorities are waiting in the lobby to discuss these discrepancies." Elena walked up to her father, stopping just inches from his collapsing frame. The smell of his expensive scotch was bitter now, the scent of a man who had finally run out of time and lies. She didn't shout. She didn't gloat. She simply leaned in, her voice a cold whisper that carried to the first few rows of witnesses. "You told me I was just a ghost in your house, Arthur, that I didn't belong in your world." She paused, letting the weight of the room's collective disgust settle over him. "But you forgot one thing. I'm the one who built the world you're standing in, and tonight I'm taking the floor out from under you." She turned her back on him before he could find his breath. As she walked toward the exit, Julian Vane stepped into stride beside her, handing her a single, sealed envelope containing the final injunctions. Elena didn't look back. Behind her, the sound of the Scotch glass hitting the marble floor echoed through the ballroom, a sharp, final crack that signaled the end of the Thorne dynasty. She stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy scent of the gala's lilies finally fading, replaced by the sharp, clean smell of a coming storm. The countdown had reached 0, and for the first time in her life, the silence was beautiful. The boardroom of Vanguard Holdings smelled of stale coffee and the sharp, metallic scent of a brewing storm. Arthur Thorne paced the length of the mahogany table, his reflection ghosting across the glass walls that overlooked the city he believed he still conquered. His suit was rumpled, a stark contrast to the iron perfection he usually wore as armor. "It's a fabrication," he barked, his voice cracking with a desperation he couldn't quite hide. He turned to Marcus Sterling, who sat at the head of the table, stone-faced. "My daughter has always had a flair for the theatrical, Marcus. You know this. The display at the gala, a temper tantrum, she's unstable. I want her removed from the building. I want her arrested for the theft of those documents." Cassidy Thorne sat in one of the plush leather chairs, her fingers flying across her phone, though her eyes were red-rimmed. "She's just jealous, Dad," she muttered, her voice dripping with a poison that felt weak in the vastness of the room. "She's been lurking in the shadows for years, bitter because I actually made something of myself. She probably forged every single one of those signatures." The heavy double doors swung open with a soft, decisive click. Elena Thorne walked in, flanked by Julian Vane. She wasn't wearing the gala dress anymore. She wore a charcoal power suit that seemed to absorb the light in the room, her hair pulled back into a spine-chillingly neat bun. She didn't look like a ghost. She looked like the architect of a new world. She didn't wait for an invitation to sit. She remained standing, her shadow falling long across the table where her father's trembling hands rested. "I'm not here for an apology, Arthur," Elena said, her voice a low, steady hum that commanded the air. "And I'm certainly not here to listen to your delusions. Julian." Julian stepped forward, placing a thick, leather-bound folder on the table. He flipped it open to reveal a series of wire transfer records and a majority shareholder agreement. "The shell corporation you've been partnering with for the last 36 months, Arthur, Apex Acquisitions. It doesn't belong to a foreign investment group. It belongs to Elena. She has been the silent majority owner of your debt, your assets, and this very floor for 3 years." Arthur's face underwent a violent transformation. The ruddy, arrogant flush of his cheeks curdled into a sickly, grayish pallor, the color of wet ash. His lower lip, usually set in a sneer of permanent condescension, began to tremble uncontrollably, revealing a glimpse of teeth that clattered softly in the sudden silence of the room. His eyes, once sharp with the habit of looking down at everyone, seemed to lose their focus, the pupils dilating until the blue of his irises was a mere thin ring of panic. A single bead of sweat broke from his receding hairline and traced a slow, jagged path through the deep wrinkles of his forehead, catching in his eyebrow before falling onto the polished mahogany table. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a man watching his own execution in slow motion. His chest heaved, a ragged, shallow breath escaping his throat that sounded like a dying engine. You couldn't have," he whispered, the words barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "I built this, I gave you everything. You gave me a name you tried to tarnish," Elena countered, her eyes like flint. "And you gave me the motivation to ensure you'd never be able to hurt anyone else the way you hurt Mom." Margaret Thorne, who had been standing silently by the window, finally turned. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear for the first time in decades. She walked toward the table, her heels clicking rhythmically on the marble. She didn't look at her husband. She looked at her daughter. "The signatures are real, Arthur," Margaret said, her voice surprisingly firm. "I saw the bank notifications. I've known for months. I just wanted to see if you'd ever tell the truth on your own. You didn't." The room felt smaller as the witnesses closed in. Marcus Sterling stood up, his presence adding a finality to the scene. "Arthur, the board has already met in an emergency session. Given the evidence of embezzlement and the shift in majority ownership, your position as chairman emeritus is terminated, effective immediately. Security is waiting downstairs to escort you to your vehicle. You have 10 minutes to clear your personal effects from the office." Cassidy gasped, her phone slipping from her hand and hitting the carpet with a dull thud. She looked at Elena, her face twisting into a mask of faux affection. "Elena, wait, we're sisters. I was confused. Dad put so much pressure on me to support him. You know how he is. We can work this out, right? I can help you with the branding. We can be a team." Elena looked at her sister, seeing the same shallow opportunism that had defined their relationship since childhood. She felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of Cassidy's laughter as she'd mocked Elena's drab life only 48 hours prior. "The branding is being handled, Cassidy," Elena said coldly. "And as for the team, Vanguard is moving in a direction that doesn't require influencers. You'll find your trust fund has been restructured. It's now tied to a strict moral turpitude clause. I suggest you find a real job before the next quarter ends." Arthur tried to stand, but his knees buckled, forcing him to catch himself on the edge of the table. He looked up at Elena, his mouth working but no sound coming out. He was a hollowed-out shell, the ghost he had once accused her of being. Elena leaned down, her face inches from his. The scent of her expensive, understated perfume, sandalwood and rain, seemed to suffocate him. "You told me I didn't belong in your world, Arthur. You were right. I don't belong in a world built on lies and bullying. She straightened up, smoothing the front of her jacket. The power in the room had shifted so completely that the air felt energized, humming with the electricity of a new era. I'm taking the floor out from under you now, she said, her voice echoing off the glass. Don't bother looking back. There's nothing left for you here. She turned and walked toward the door. Julian followed, his stride confident. As she reached the exit, she heard the sound of a heavy chair being pushed back, the sound of a man finally collapsing under the weight of his own ego. Elena stepped out into the hallway, the bright LED lights reflecting off the polished floors. She didn't stop to watch the security team enter the boardroom. She didn't need to see the end. She was already focused on the beginning. What's next? Julian asked as they reached the elevators. Elena pressed the button, her reflection in the brushed steel doors showing a woman who had finally stepped out of the shadows. Next, we rebuild. And this time, the foundation won't be made of glass. The elevator chimed, the doors sliding open to reveal a path forward. Elena stepped inside, the silence of the hallway a beautiful, earned victory. But as the doors began to close, her phone buzzed in her pocket, a private number she didn't recognize. She glanced at the screen, her brow furrowing as a single text message appeared. You think it's over. You've only opened the vault. Elena stared at the words as the elevator began its descent, the weight of the victory suddenly feeling heavy with a new, unanswered question. 6 months had passed since the glass walls of Vanguard Holdings ceased to be a cage and became a kingdom. Elena stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new executive suite, the morning sun casting long, sharp shadows across the mahogany desk. The air here smelled of expensive lilies and old, leather-bound books, a far cry from the stale, oppressive atmosphere of her father's study. She adjusted the cuff of her silk blouse, feeling the weight of the platinum watch Marcus Sterling had gifted her for the quarterly merger. It was a silent, heavy reminder of how far she'd climbed and how much she'd left behind. Arthur Thorne no longer commanded rooms. He barely commanded his own hands, which were trembling as he sat across from her in the sterile conference room of the mediation center. This wasn't a boardroom. It was a place where reputations went to die quietly. He wore a suit that had grown too large for his frame, the fabric sagging at the shoulders like the skin of a shedding snake. Beside him, Cassidy Thorne looked like a ghost of her former self. Her designer handbag was scuffed at the edges, and her phone, once her primary weapon for social assassination, sat dark and silent on the table. The influencer's brand had not survived the revelation of her sister's true standing, and the public's thirst for her downfall had been unquenchable. We just need enough to keep the estate, Elena, Margaret Thorne whispered. Her voice, once a sharp instrument of social correction, was now thin and brittle. She didn't look like the matriarch of a dynasty anymore. She looked like a tired woman who had spent 40 years backing the wrong horse. She wouldn't meet her daughter's eyes, focusing instead on the steam rising from a cup of bitter, untouched tea. Elena didn't answer immediately. She let the silence stretch, the hum of the building's ventilation the only sound in the room. She remembered the wine stain on her dress, the laughter at the dinner table, and the years she had spent being the disappointment while she secretly built the empire they were now begging to share. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a single, black ledger. "The text I received the night of the board meeting," she began, her voice calm and level, "wasn't a threat. I thought it was Arthur trying one last desperate play, but it wasn't." She glanced at Julian Vane, who sat at her right hand, his expression unreadable. "It was an automated notification from a vault my grandfather established 30 years ago. A vault that only opens when the majority share of Vanguard changes hands outside the direct line of the sitting CEO. Arthur's head snapped up. His eyes, clouded with the onset of age and defeat, searched hers for a glimmer of the daughter he thought he knew. "Your grandfather." He never mentioned a vault. "Because he knew you, father," she said, the word father landing like a stone in a still pond. "He knew that if you were ever in a position to lose the company, it would be because of your own arrogance. The vault didn't contain money. It contained the original deeds to the Thorne family holdings, the ones you've been using as collateral for your failed overseas ventures. She slid a document across the table. It was a formal eviction notice for the family estate. The room went cold. Cassidy let out a sharp, choked sob, her manicured nails digging into the plastic armrests of her chair. The realization hit them all at once. The house, the history, the very floor they stood on during their most arrogant moments, it all belonged to the woman they had spent a lifetime belittling. "I'm not a monster," Elena said, though she felt a strange, detached coldness in her chest. "I've set up a trust. It will provide a modest apartment in the city and a monthly stipend. It's more than you gave me when you tried to write me out of the will." "You're throwing us out?" Arthur's voice was a raspy shadow of its former roar. "After everything I built." "You built a facade," she corrected him. "I built the foundation. And as I told you before, a foundation made of glass cannot support the weight of the truth." She stood up, the motion fluid and decisive. Julian rose with her, gathering the papers into a neat stack. There would be no more shouting, no more dramatic reveals. The fire had burned out, leaving only the ash of a family that had never truly been a family at all. As she walked toward the door, she paused, looking back at the three people who shared her blood but none of her soul. She saw the cost of her victory in the way Margaret slumped her shoulders, and in the way Arthur stared at the eviction notice as if it were a foreign language he couldn't decode. She had won everything. She owned the towers, the accounts, and the names. But as she stepped out into the hallway, the silence of the corridor felt vast and echoing. "Elena," Julian said softly, catching up to her. "Are you okay?" She looked at her reflection in the polished brass of the elevator doors. She saw a woman who was powerful, wealthy, and untouchable. But for a fleeting second, she also saw the girl who just wanted to belong at the dinner table. She blinked, and the image vanished, replaced by the sharp, cold gaze of the CEO of Vanguard Holdings. "I'm fine, Julian," she said, her voice steady as the elevator chimed. "I've just realized that the hardest part of winning a war isn't the battle. It's deciding what to do with the silence that follows." The doors slid shut, sealing her in a world of her own making, while behind her, the last remnants of the Thorne legacy crumbled into the quiet dust of the mediation room. She was the only one left standing, and for the first time in her life, there was no doubt left to conquer.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.